not because of the nature of the lecture, but it's Peter Eisenman, and he seems quite intimidating in these kind of formats. What I will say, I'm quite interested in hearing what he would actually say on this topic, because this isn't an endeavor to impose hindsight on a person who didn't have it. I think this is somewhat of an unfair practice, particularly given the scope of this research. It's also not an attempt to deconstructively or destructively critique Eisenman in terms of his approach to architecture, but rather what I'm curious about is Eisenman appears to me, after going through this study, to be a person who's devoted a significant portion of his life, if not all of it, to the practice, teaching, and extension of architecture in a meaningful way. What has happened, however, is some of the tools he had relied upon, by his own admission, didn't work so well as he thought, or didn't work as constructively or as critically as he thought when faced by this giant thing we call capitalism. So the question I have is, can we build upon his errors? Can we learn from his mistakes and actually try to build a form of architecture as discourse, as practice, as discipline that has a better shot at that? That is, can we build a discourse that builds upon some of these trials and errors rather than merely repeats the same mistakes over and over again? So diving into this, the meta project. Metaphysical as a word, I think, will never make sense to me. I don't know why. It's just a term that never sticks to me properly intellectually. As far as I can grasp in terms of how Eisenman speaks of it, the metaphysical project is a stream of intellectual thought, an endeavor that weaves across your entire body of work. And the goal is to not get digested by the microcosm of each individual project, but rather use the microcosm of each individual project to propel this broader endeavor, these grander questions, these questions that require a much longer time frame to begin to investigate. And Eisenman, when you look at the nature of his work, he certainly has attempted to do this. If you look at his first works to his last works, the way in which he's approaching it in terms of this interwoven relationship between the physicality of architecture and the conceptual recognition that can be spurred through that physicality, which subsequently alters the second or subsequent physical understandings of the space, which then impacts the conceptual, and so on and so forth. This uneasy and not so easy resolution of architecture is something that he's tried to push from his first steps to his current steps. So that's the nature of the meta project, according to Eisenman. And interestingly, when he's framing this, one of the first people he mentions is Corbusier. Corbusier, for Eisenman, is a person who framed a specific grammar, a specific rhetoric of modern architecture in the early 20th century. He refined it and pushed it in a way that behaved almost as an insular floating mass that was able to refine itself internally and play certain grammatical and rhetorical games internally without having to fall to the constraints and the fetters of contemporary society. What he argues after after World War II is that with modernism no longer being operational, meaning that it no longer, this floating mass of rhetoric and grammar no longer seemed to be a useful or critical tool in the contemporary day. Critical is a better word there rather than useful. That there was no more grammar, no rhetoric in that immediate aftermath. And so architects simply produced architecture by getting absorbed into the microcosms of each project rather than using the microcosm of each project to propel something grander. Another person he mentions is Mies. And Mies, when he talks about Mies, the notion of capital starts to emerge a bit more heavily. So for Eisenman, Mies begins to operate in this era where the modernist project shifts from being sort of the pursuit of good society to being something more about the pursuit of a good life. That is consumption-based, some sort of corporatization of the idea, And in this time period, a vast number of corporate projects begin to be propelled throughout the architectural sphere. Mies is one of the people, obviously, who gets a series of commissions in this realm. And the Seagram building, although Eisenman critiques it, he also praises Mies and says Mies doesn't get absorbed by capital, that his meta project has enough momentum and enough rigor behind it that it's able to somehow avoid the shackles of these constraining capitalistic project that is growing. Then we jump to learning from Las Vegas, and he isolates specifically learning from Las Vegas, Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown, rather than complexity and contradiction. And here he says capitalism morphs. It morphs into something that isn't just about the corporate realm, but now begins to engage with aspects beyond it in terms of media, in terms of marketing, in terms of branding, and so forth. And for Eisenman, this is a critical juncture where Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown can no longer avoid the accommodation of capital, that part of their meta project becomes absorbed by capital. Another aspect that he mentions is that the dichotomy between genius loci and zeitgeist, which historically have been sort of opposing camps and seem to be actually rooted in sort of capitalist, anti-capitalist contentions, starts to dissolve that barrier between the two. According to Eisenman, again, the genius loci camp and phenomenology camp start to become absorbed by zeitgeist. That is, genius loci becomes the phenomena of capital, the zeitgeist of the day. A fourth phase and the final phase for Eisenman, and yes, that is Rem Koolhaas with hair. I've never seen that photo prior as well. For some reason, I always thought when I think of a baby Koolhaas, I just scale him down and he with the same head. But this is the fourth phase according to Eisenman, right? Here, the meta project is nearly entirely enveloped by capital, and the movements into branding and signage and so forth that begins with learning from Las Vegas now becomes accelerated, and capital takes on whole nother realms. The shed versus duck dichotomy collapses, and you start to see decorated ducks emerge. And despite all this, actually, Rem is held quite high by Eisenman, and is a person who's able to achieve something meta despite this. So this is the phasing that Eisenman sets out for us. This is the framework for how the meta project evolves and how it reacts to capital over time, with Corbusier sort of able to avoid it, establish a healthy distance. Mies, it begins to sink a bit more by the weight of capital. Venturi and Denise Scott-Brown, again, it's absorbed much more significantly, and by the time we hit Rem, the meta project and capital are overlapping very, very significantly, to the point that they may not be distinguished from one another. So this is the easiest way I've thought of how to explain this. If you think of what Eisenman is talking about, it seems to be that the meta project has to achieve a certain critical distance from the world and the contemporary constraints of the day in order to be able to offer critical alternatives than what is being imagined. So for Eisenman, Corbusier is a very healthy meta project. When we get to Mies, that mass begins to sink. The cloud begins to sink. It's almost touching capital. Capital is beginning to grasp at it, but Mies has enough momentum that he's able to push it forward. When we get to Denise Scott-Brown and Robert Venturi, it has sunk even further, and now the meta project is beginning to mesh in an uncomfortable way with capital. And then finally, when we get to Rem Koolhaas, the meta project has become consumed by capital, or so significantly overlapped with it that it's hard to distinguish the two. But as I mentioned, for Eisenman, Rem is one of these people who've been able to achieve some sort of meta project even within these groups. He flips things around, he skews the broader framework, and then he achieves some sort of meta depth out of it. And Rem seems to be one of the few people actually that Eisenman consistently mentions as a person who's able to achieve a critical meta project despite the significant issues of the day. So this is the argument that I'm proposing, that Eisenman, just as the framework he's established in terms of the decline of the meta project in its consummation, or consumption rather, by capitalism, that I think Eisenman actually goes through comparable phases. And this has to do with the grammar of the project, the language of the meta project, the syntax, the vocabulary, the rhetoric, whatever terminology is most fitting there. Within the earlier phases of Eisenman's career, you see what I think we understand Eisenman to be pervasively. That is, a person engaged in a very interesting language, a very interesting rhetoric. He's talking about a physicality of architecture, spurring a certain conceptual understanding of that architecture, which then spurs a subsequent physical understanding of the structure, which then spurs a second subsequent conceptual understanding of the building. He spins a fantastic web of rhetorical imagination here that seems to be that cloud, the cloud of Corbusier floating above the world, untethered and offering insights and critique at a distance, but close enough, I guess, that it can still achieve reality. In the second phase, Eisenman is sort of in the Mies mode, right? He has shifted his vocabulary slightly. He's not talking so academically, and perhaps the nature of his wording has shifted slightly as well. He's talking about habitation and occupation, but he's still fully in charge of his craft, and he still believes here that the meta project that he's pursuing can actually offer significant critiques of much more significant hierarchies of society, right? It's not simply a formal game, but that formal game has a significant capacity to alter our behavior in a meaningful way. At the end of his career, something changes, and this is one of the few quotes I'll read here. He says, if we accept the situation that there's not going to be a revolution, then the situation is full of rhetoric. The rhetoric of branding, the rhetoric of surface, the rhetoric of product, the rhetoric of expansion. What is the grammar of architecture? Where is the architecture to be? And I think that what faces us as architects, as teachers, and as students is we don't have a grammar to fulfill the rhetoric if we accept the rhetoric. And there's not much to do, meaning there's nothing much we can do. Even if we reject it, the revolution isn't coming, in his words. In other words, what is the grammar of a 40-story tower? What is the grammar of a 500,000 square foot shopping mall? So this, in terms of grammar, is vastly different than what we encounter Eisenman in the earlier stages, in that his meta project is no longer working with a vocabulary that is beyond capital. Actually, he's adopted the vocabulary of capital into his meta project. And if you're paying attention here, I'm omitting this specific third moment here where he's Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, particularly because I left it for this moment, and that I think it's a critical juncture in his career. It's a critical juncture because I think it's at this moment, and I don't understand the reasoning why, if it's through trying to achieve more competitiveness as a firm or whatnot, he actually opens the gates for the grammar of the capitalist project to enter into his grammar of the meta project. At this point, he's talking about lasers, rock concerts, raves, sound, light, movement, color, shopping malls, Disney World, and so on. And he's framing it in a manner where this seems to have overcome not all, but significant portions of his prior grammar. So for Eisenman, this is the healthy place to be, right? Either you're Corbusier or you're Mies. Corbusier, I think, is the healthiest distance, which we can think of as 1975 Eisenman. And Mies is sort of 1980s Eisenman, where the vocabulary and the grammar and the meta project has gotten a bit closer to the dynamics of the contemporary world, or the constraints of the contemporary world, but it still has enough momentum that it isn't controlled by capital. And so this is the sequence that's set in motion, right? We have the cloud of the meta project gradually being consumed by capital. And the critical juncture, once more, is this third phase, where it seems to be that he's opened the doors. Whether he had to or whether he chose to is unclear to me. for the grammar of capital to enter. And after that, the decline isn't the right word, the descent of the meta project becomes more aggressive, and the enveloping or the embrace of capital around it becomes more dramatic. Another way to look at this is the client-architect power relations, and you see a similar narrative begin to emerge. So in the earlier portions, Eisenman is simply interested about producing architecture of competence. He doesn't really play too much into what his clientele are, who wants to build it or whatnot. He simply wants a source that will produce the architecture that he's interested in. Meaning in that state, he has a full sort of control over the clients and the projects that he's picking. Client isn't coming to him and dictating the project. It's actually quite the opposite. Within the me stage, he still has quite significant amount of power and control. In fact, maybe it's even grown to a significant degree here. In this lecture in particular, the architecture and the problem of weak image. Eisenman, for instance, talks about developers coming to him requesting projects of that mimic sort of previous projects he's done or in a similar vein. And he says, no, you can't afford this, pushing clients away, and then they come back insisting that they can, and he gets them built anyway. So in this dynamic, again, Eisenman clearly has once more the upper hand over the client. In this third stage, something again shifts. He no longer says, he puts a caveat on why he's being hired. He says, I'm not here just because I'm a good architect. I'm also here because I'm mediatable. I'm good at media. And he links his career, actually. He says that to sustain a career, that you need to depend upon media to a significant degree. And in the final stages, you see the client architect relationship. Inversion isn't proper, but it seems like the client is now having an upper hand in terms of the nature of the project. He mentions this quite a few times in his 2010 lecture, wherein he had a 40-story tower project for, I want to say Milan, and he didn't want to build a 40-story tower, but the client insisted, and basically the lecture ends with him, or that specific note of the lecture ends with him saying, okay, so we have to build a 40-story tower. Now, I think this is the actual project that he's talking about in terms of its final outcome, which it seems like he's actually produced 6 to 8-story buildings. It's not clear how this occurs, whether it's actually a pushback against the client from him, or through local ordinances, or through cost efficiencies and so on. But this is an interesting one to note, that actually how he talks about it may have had a different outcome in the end. Another one he mentions again is this 500,000 square foot shopping mall. This isn't that one. This is a station in Pompeii, but it's of a similar scale. And again, a similar dynamic emerges in terms of how he discusses it. He says he doesn't want to build a 500,000 square foot shopping mall. That's the last thing we need. It's on a beach, I believe, in Naples. But the client insists, no, we want a shopping mall. And he says, okay, I guess we're building a shopping mall. And he even ends this by saying, what do you need an architect for? They're basically looking for signage and all the spaces designed. So the client is pulling a bit more weight, significant more weight than they were able to do in prior versions. And this is how the sort of trajectory ends, with Eisenman saying this line: at what point do you retire? I'm not convinced that we are any longer in control. And what he's talking about control, what he's referencing to here is obviously client-architect relations and so forth, but also about the control of scale, the control of the economic construct in which you're working, and more importantly for him, I think, is the control of intensity. How much intensity can you actually dedicate to the craft of architecture, which for Eisenman is a critical part of the meta project. And this is a screenshot of that sequence. To call it depressed is completely out of line, but there is a somberness to Eisenman's voice when he's talking about, is it time to retire, that is quite unavoidable There's a gravity, there's a weight that clearly shows that the weight of the world is on his shoulders a bit, quite significantly more than it was in his youth. So the question is, what happened? And I'll propose three options here. The first option is an issue of scale, of media, and of these client-architect relations. So scale obviously is a huge difference in terms of Eisenman in his youth versus Eisenman today, from houses to vast complexes and vast stations and city designs. There's clearly a shift in scale that takes place that perhaps helps to or supports the loss of control that Eisenman is talking about. The other aspect is media. Eisenman is very prolific and very generous in terms of interviews and panel discussions and lectures and so forth. And he's persistently in, we can say, the academic media, but also popular media in this regard. And maybe there's something about the media oversaturation has led to this kind of loss of control. I think Eisenman here summarizes the point fairly well, or his approach to the point. He says, I think that what happens is that we architects become prisoners of globalization, media, etc. He's talking specifically about capital and the issue of scale. And it seems to be that this is a viable option, that his meta project was sound and that it had the right framework, but simply due to this expanded scale of capital, the expanded speed of capital, and similarly of media, that the initial framework wasn't resolute enough to withstand that kind of pressure. The second option, which I hinted at earlier, is maybe a syntactical slip. That in this third phase, that Eisenman maybe opened the door in a way that he didn't predict. And a lot of the images, the thumbnails that the AA has for Eisenman, I don't know why his hands are always up in a lot of them. And it's not an accurate representation of the mood of the lecture by any means. But for some reason, I keep returning to this image as a sort of, it's probably a psychoanalytic projection of sorts. But it's at this moment that I think he's actually quite enamored by capital, by architecture as an event. And maybe he opens up the doors and allows for his meta project to devolve into something a bit more vulnerable. Again, he's talking about rock concerts, raves, sound, light, color, movement, terms I think that seem significantly at odds with how you see Eisenman talk in the 1975 lecture, for instance. And again, the great challenges being the shopping mall is not a term you expect to hear, for instance, of Eisenman in the 1975 lecture. Another layer of this is actually Eisenman's approach to phenomenology, or specifically an anti-phenomenological approach. A lot of his dissertation onwards, his career was based upon pursuing a rigorous critique of the genius loci branch of architecture through a specific zeitgeist approach and a specific anti-phenomenological approach. I think, again, if you dig into the relationship between Tafuri and Eisenman, there seems to be a link there that connects the critique of genius loci to be a critique of capital. But in any case, the anti-phenomenological approach of Eisenman in 1975 is very different than the approach that we encounter in 1990s. In that the 1990s Eisenman seems to be blurring this boundary between phenomena and anti-phenomena, zeitgeist and genius loci to a degree that you don't have that separation in prior years. And maybe this is just another aspect. And maybe this is just another aspect of what he framed earlier, that as capital expands, it blurs this boundary between zeitgeist and genius loci. And maybe Eisenman is simply a product of these times, that the collapse of this traditional historic dichotomy led to a significant porosity within his meta project. And this is where Eisenman frames this condition, right? Where as capital expands, genius loci becomes zeitgeist, that is capital phenomena. A third option, which I think is the one that I find most intriguing, is maybe the initial meta project itself didn't have enough resistance to struggle against the contemporary forces of global capitalism. Meaning that when Eisenman was forming his initial meta project, he dealt a lot with social dynamics and formal dynamics and cultural dynamics and so forth, but he consciously avoided economic dynamics, political dynamics, programmatic dynamics, ecological dynamics, and so on. And so when the nature of capital begins to pull at the meta project, it doesn't have the vocabulary to be able to resist this, because it's not actually offering an alternate route. It's not offering a weight in the same level. And so what naturally occurs is the meta project sinks and becomes enveloped by these strong forces against which the meta project doesn't have an innate immunity, doesn't have an innate resistance. Another option that could have occurred is if instead of the initial framework of the meta project, the social, the formal, the cultural, and so forth, if Eisenman had actually embedded the economic and the programmatic within this initial meta project. Now for Eisenman, it seems that the avoidance of these two variables was part of the way through which he achieved distance. And when I say embedding economic or programmatic dynamics, I don't mean an absorption or accommodation of the existing economic programmatic dynamics of global capitalism. Rather, what I'm asserting is that you can you can project alternate economic and programmatic paths that are beyond the scope of contemporary realm, while still maintaining a healthy distance and while still maintaining a critical practice. And obviously, given the contemporary sphere, ecology and political dynamics are likely things that you have to include within this as well. What this ends up coming back to, and this is based, I think, links a bit to a conversation that I had with a colleague recently who graduated from the GSD, Will Smith, is the notion of the modernist project. So the way we had discussed this with Will was sort of in a biographical manner, where we were talking about our own education. So I did my undergrad in Auburn University in Southeast United States, and then graduate school in Cornell in the Northeast, and then PhD in the Pacific Northwest at the University of Oregon. I met Will at the University of Oregon, and he subsequently finished his graduate degree at the GSD. And so we had a discussion about East Coast and West Coast discourses and how they vary. And what we encountered was sort of an overlap in terms of our own perceptions, that the modernist project was this very intriguing moment in the early 20th century, where the architect and architecture held the political, the economic, the social, the ecological, the formal, the cultural, etc., all within their hand, and tried to achieve an ambitious path with it. Obviously, there were quite significant disasters, to put it simply, within this approach. And what occurred, it seems, is that the metaphysical project of the modernist era essentially creates a schism. There are certain schools of thought that adopt the sort of formal and the cultural approach to architecture and mute, for instance, the ecological or the socioeconomic. And then there's other schools of thought that believe architecture and the built environment can significantly influence the ecological and the programmatic and the economic, but maybe they mute, for instance, the formal and the cultural, meaning that the formal and the cultural should come either not through the authorship of a top-down architect, or inversely, it should come through the bottom-up generation of the community. So these were the schools that these were the schools that we went to, essentially, and we were trying to peg this on a broader gradient of things. I've avoided putting it on a gradient here just because it's, I think we need a three-dimensional gradient to do it. But for sure, you can start to see schools of thought that stress certain aspects and mute other aspects in terms of what's within the purview of architecture. And there's other schools that do the opposite. So what I think is at hand, and maybe not only interesting, but actually maybe quite necessary to try to bridge the critical capacities of the meta project as framed by Eisenman, is that we may need to stitch or revisit or revitalize some of the ambitions of the modernist project. Obviously learn from the cataclysmic disasters that it put forth, but the notion that architecture can influence and exert causal weight over a range of realms, it seems that this may be a necessary discussion, a necessary discourse that we need to promote and support and see where it goes if we are to promote a meta project as a way of dealing with capital and as a way of establishing a critical practice within the context of capital. Again, so if this is the approach that Eisenman framed, maybe this is what we need to try to do with the revitalization of the meta project. And that's my 2 cents. So again, I tried to frame this in as raw and woven fabric format as possible. I hope it promotes some sort of discussion here. Peter Eisenman, if he ends up listening to this, I'd be very curious on his take. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So questions, comments?
The audience is welcome to put questions in Q&A or in the chat, and we'll be kind of taking those questions and giving them to our speaker. So don't hesitate to type your questions into the chat or Q&A.
Can we start the conversation then? Yeah, just a question. Thanks for your talk. A great work of documenting, the lectures of Peter Eisenman at the AA and tracing them, in order to understand how he's evolving. You didn't mention, or you didn't refer too much to the word autonomy, which is at the center of Peter Eisenman, and the center of the misreadings of Peter Eisenman as someone who was apolitical, as your quote seemed to indicate. Actually, he cultivated that kind of idea consciously. There's this well-known anecdote of the founding of the journal Oppositions, in which there was this struggle between him and Ken Frampton. Ken Frampton being this European social democrat, totally engaged in politics, and he kind of like claiming for form, and the autonomy of the field, like the capacity, or like the claiming the space, to discuss architecture in its own terms. And therefore, the graphic design of the journal reads as zero positions, by widening out, the piece, it's kind of confusing because you can read oppositions or you can read zero positions, meaning oppositions like this kind of Ken Frampton's. I mean, we have to remember he was someone influenced by Frankfurt School, and he was someone influenced by Hannah Arendt. And on the other hand, so on the other hand, you have the other guy who's kind of like asking, for some kind of autonomous discussion within the field. In a way, and that, I mean, the discussion of autonomy was circulating in the Italian debate, for many years. And actually, there was this response by Pier Vittorio Aureli not so long ago on the issue of autonomy, which actually was, for him, was a misreading of embracement, of the word autonomy and applied, wrongly, to our field, in the sense that autonomy had to do with labor requirements and labor demonstrations and labor struggles back in the days, in the 60s in Italy. I mean, meaning the capacity of labor to become autonomous from capital, autonomous from the mode of production, autonomous from other things. And I wonder I don't know, if you, well, if you read or if you are familiar with the work of Pier Vittorio Aureli, and how do you see this?
Yeah, what I would say, so there's a conscious blindness, I guess, embedded into the research project in that, again, we're trying to approach how Eisenman approached capitalism based on his own articulated terms. I think there's something about how architects speak, it's very different than how we write, and it's very different than how we practice. And the question was, how does he vocalize his relationship with capital, and how does that evolve over time? That's sort of a research constraint, right? The autonomy, I can't remember if in the scope of his lectures he actually uses that word quite extensively or not. However, there is similar conversations, I would say, that occur, for instance, in the 1975 and the 1983 lectures, I want to say, the first 2 or 3 lectures, as well, the sort of, I think it's the weak image one, and the symposium on complexity of the city, and then the first one is the conceptual architecture symposium, where a few people sort of push back against him and ask for what you're phrasing, right? What are his sociopolitical and socioeconomic positions? And in some instances, he pushes back quite clearly, and he says, I actually don't care. Again, that's the 1975 point in the conceptual architecture. He says, I'm just worried about competence. And I think, again, that is his way of establishing autonomy, as you're framing it, that to avoid the muddle of socioeconomics, of sociopolitics, of political economics of the day, for him was a way of establishing healthy distance in the meta project. What seems to occur at the end, however, is what I think occurs is that his avoidance of that realm completely may be one of the reasons why the meta project collapses and gets devoured and digested by capitalistic grammar and so forth. That's one aspect to consider. There is another realm of sort of in the 1980s, again, when he's lecturing beyond the 1975 one. 1975 one is a very interesting one because he's smoking a pipe and he's very sort of, he has this swagger of youth and so on. And he's actually smoking a pipe while answering questions, etc. But in the 1980s, when he's answering similar questions, he says something interesting where somebody from the audience asks him that same question, what is his position on this and that? And he flutters a bit and says, well, tell me what's important to you and I'll try to frame something in that light, which is a very unusual thing to say, but he's basically saying, talk a bit and let me understand what you're saying. And then that's when the comment about hierarchies comes in, that he thinks by playing these formal, this interwoven and reciprocal relationship between concept and physicality, that he thinks he frames that his objective is to actually promote the questioning and potential subversion of broader hierarchies. That's one level. The third one I would point out is, I think it's in the architecture in the age of media, which is that critical juncture where I'm saying he becomes Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. There at the end, he has a discussion with a sort of one-on-one talk. And they ask him about, okay, these formal games, they're very nice, but how do you deal with the broader complexities and inequities and imbalances of current society? And there he struggles quite a bit and can't quite formulate an answer, which I think, again, is why that particular moment may be quite critical, in that his answers keep revolving back to this notion of the laser, the rock concert, consumption-based media, and so forth. And in the end, he realizes, I think, that he's not quite giving the answer that's expected. Then he taps into something about sort of the ecology of the city and systems of the city and so forth, and frames that in a way that begins to at least peripherally touch issues of socioeconomics and those aspects. I'm not sure if the original autonomy that, I'm not sure how long that original autonomy that Eisenman tried to create lasted. because it seems quite quickly that his initial stance of, I don't care, I'm not even going to answer that, I'm simply interested in competence, that answer seems to go away pretty quickly. And he begins to formulate, at least on some level, some propositions that deal with socioeconomics and things of that sort. It's just not embedded within the initial framework. And I think that's the point that I'm leaning towards a bit, that if that socioeconomics was part of how he achieved distance autonomy, then the meta project may have been much more resilient in withstanding the pressures of capital.
May I jump in?
Yeah.
Thank you, Cem, for inspiring talk. So, what is a bit difficult to stitch together, to use your terms, is that you're looking at a very specific set of events, which are these lectures at the AA, in very detail. And the kinds of, like the question of autonomy may or may not have appeared in those lectures, but we clearly see both in his work, either drawn, modeled, or built work, a different set of considerations and emphases, and we also see that in his writings. And so the question for me is, in your project, if there is an intention at some point to gauge what is derived from the articulations of these series of lectures against the writings or against the built work, to see if there are in fact divergences, if there are parallels, if there are issues that were central to his meta narrative that never appeared in the articulations. So this is, to me, this is a kind of a critical question in terms of your project. Like, how do we take this small, I shouldn't say small, but this enveloped project, which has to do with the articulations of the lecture, and contextualize it in the bigger projects of Eisenman's entire career? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So we actually, we approached it in a bit of a reversed engineered format, I suppose, again, for a sort of conscious blindness to be embedded within the work, in that we went through the lectures first and then went through a literature review afterwards. And so within the literature review, which really deals with looking at Eisenman's work over time in terms of writings, in terms of critiques of his work, in terms of critiques of Eisenman in relation to capital and so forth. That literature review is actually conducted after. I didn't include it here specifically. Again, it would stretch another 3 hours if that was the case. But the thought I have is there's consistent stories and narratives about portions of architectural discourse that seem to have pervasive blind spots that are repeated. Again, the one that repeatedly comes up for me within this the context of this research is the notion of Eisenman being apolitical. The notion of Eisenman being strictly within the realm of humanities, linguistics, mathematics, again, syntax, structure, things of this sort, formal linguistics, philosophy, what have you, anything but politics, effectively. And part of the question that I had is the way in which this kind of discourse is propagated, is it rooted in the fact that we keep relying on similar pieces of literature, similar pieces within the discourse? So that's part of it. So the thought was, can we approach the discourse in a consciously blind manner and see if a different story begins to emerge? and for me, at least, the Eisenman that emerges out of this is very different than the Eisenman that I've been taught in significant portions of undergrad, grad, and beyond. So I think there's something quite curious there. The framing of the findings within his broader body of work, again, is something that takes place within the Lit Review. But I would say the broader project, actually, that this moves into isn't sort of an intensive look at Eisenman, which it's fascinating to look at it, but I think the so what or but why question emerges there. I don't think there's while it would be a fascinating endeavor, I don't think it's hard to imagine that that project would have so significant of a impact beyond my own curiosity. So the next step that actually occurs out of this is to use this pilot study as a way of looking at the broader articulations of architecture in general from the 1970s to the current day. Again, using the AA archives as basis, but looking through not just a single person, but looking through their entire archive of lectures and seeing actually how are there patterns, are there commonalities, are there overlaps with how we tend to discuss and talk about our relationship with capitalism, and are there, you know, repeated failings and repeated inabilities to learn from one another's mistakes. I think that's where the big project goes, which is something we started applying for funding at the beginning of this year. So it's a bit of a difficult one. Well, I do agree. I mean, it would be fascinating to frame fully Eisenman within the complete context of his work. I think the research project in general is heading in a different direction. I think the Lit Review, we can probably buff up a bit more to include not just his writings, but I think we should include much more significant look at his works, as you're saying, because I think that's probably a blind spot that if we uncover commonalities or points that negate some of these narratives, there may be more interesting complexities that emerge from it.
We have a question from Denise Costanzo that'll come next.
Hi, Jim. So I'll mostly read from what I was typing, even though it's probably not super clear. Again, this was just a fascinating, rich lecture. I'm really glad you're talking about the similarities between Eisenman and Venturi, because I do think they're strong and they're interesting and often under discussed. And I just wanted to build on Pep's question about autonomy, because I don't think I heard you use the word formalism, which anyone coming out of Cornell, right? That should be
yeah.
there in your talk. So as I sort of framed in the question I wrote, the idea that architects can change the world through form, which is something we would probably all stand by, is obviously not the same as formalism. Or, you know, obviously in Eisenman's case, following in the tradition of Colin Rowe, et cetera, this privileging of syntax over semantics. And I'm thinking very much about the way Kenneth Frampton in particular came down so hard on Venturi and Scott Brown for, quote, doing capitalism's dirty work, right? By prettying up essentially the ravaging of the American landscape and society. But generally speaking, whatever the aesthetic of the formalism we're talking about, we can say it serves to hold socioeconomic issues at bay, or at least pretends to, or even, you know, provides a veil or a camouflage for these. So I guess I just wanted to sort of prod you a little bit about formalism as a term, whether it, you know, is evading or serving capitalism and how it plays out in Eisenman. And then I had a second question, which you can address or ignore. You know, when you talk about the arc of his career and the increasing scale of his projects, we also have to think about the fact that he's doing this work as an academic. You know, someone like Venturi, who had a small period of time in academia, but spent most of his career strictly in practice. And then Eisenman's relationship with jobs, design, commissions is very different for that reason as well. Okay, that's probably too much, but thank you.
No, thanks. Again, it's very helpful to hear all the questions. Again, the way we're structuring it is more how to refine it after this point. In terms of formalism and why it doesn't come up, part of how we had to go through the lectures, again, was to engage how he thought he engaged capital. And form for sure was an aspect of it, but when he talked about form, it didn't directly link to capital the way in which other realms did. And meaning that you would have to, if we strip away the veil of blindness that we have to consciously impose for the project to work, then it starts to open up a whole series of uncontrolled variables, I guess, or tangents that would have, I think, altered the course of the research, which may be in more enriching ways. But the thought was, okay, we're establishing blinders, let's keep them and let's see what gets produced out of it. So the way he talks about some of the key words that he does talk about in relation to capitalism that you don't pick up on so easy. For instance, if you have the Tafuri reading, and if you watch, which I happen to do, the lecture in which Eisenman talks about the sort of the genius loci versus the zeitgeist exhibitions that were planned against one another, with Tafuri essentially funding the zeitgeist exhibition and him being part of that crew. You see, for instance, phenomenology or anti-material or anti-phenomenology, how he talks about those terms are things that you would overlook as being not directly linked to capital. But if you have the understanding that Tafuri has some sort of influence on him, and if you read Tafuri's reading prior, then you begin to catch those things when he says, okay, anti-phenomena, okay, it seems like he's still within this vein. It seems like he's still within this thread of linking material and anti-material and conceptual versus non-conceptual architecture as a sort of continuation of Tafuri's critique of capital in architecture. That's one aspect. So formalism wasn't one of those things that within our blinders actively operated as a way in which, form wasn't a way in which he actively sought to refute, subvert, or achieve distance from capital within these series of lectures. There were aspects of it that began to emerge earlier on in the 1975 lecture, for instance, but there, when he's talking about it, it's about this it's about this rhetoric, this grammar of the meta project, but it never hits the ground fully as a critique of capital. In terms of his career, again, economic security and his academic career, actually the Lit Review opened up quite a few interesting sub-narratives to this, particularly, his relationship with Philip Johnson and, the sort of collapse of the architectural world during a specific period of time where architectural writing achieves this very convoluted and Foucauldian obfuscationist sort of nature to it. And that certainly opens some things up, particularly in terms of where the academic and the writings cease to be the only source of bread and butter, the only source of income for him, or the most significant one. And he began to, the practice started to kick up. And when the practice starts to kick up in terms of the broader context of, where his strategies of form lie within the broader arc of architecture, I think there's something quite interesting. And maybe that ties back to the question that Mehrdad posed, is if we can actually begin to link those two stories, it starts to form a much more layered and critical fabric. But the form one, again, I know I've betrayed the Cornell upbringing with this, but it's again just an exercise of research constraints, and we're trying to create a pilot study of what we can grasp of this so that we can push the broader project forward. And again, the broader project isn't an intensive 10-year study of Eisenman, but actually sort of a 3-year study of or rather a 2-year study of architecture's relationship to capital as articulated in lectures. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Blanche, you're next. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'm a MArch graduate student, and I was actually in the Arch 419 class earlier, so I had very great discussions with your students. I was just curious, what do you think, or how do you think Eisenman would react to a country declaring their governmental architectural style as classical, with his position on architecture and capitalism, since the government's directly related to capitalism? And then I also had another question that I thought of when you were talking about the different forms of material you're gathering for your project. Have you ever thought of compiling a sort of storyboard to present your materials, since it seems like there's all these stories about Eisenman?
That's interesting. We actually used a concept board, or sort of a Miro equivalent, to begin compiling this stuff. It was quite helpful, particularly when we were dealing with how the lectures begin to collide with the other types of media. But I think I hadn't thought of it as a presentation format. That could be quite interesting. In terms of his reaction to classical, I think that's quite a funny one. One thing I've noticed about Eisenman through these lectures is he doesn't quite get, he's very monotone. He sort of raises a bit and goes down a bit in terms of his, but I think his heart rate is fairly consistent throughout. I imagine he would sort of laugh it off and talk about it as a strange act of a bureaucrat or something like this. But I can't imagine actually Eisenman being surprised by it. And I think part of that is the benefit of distance. And I think as you think about the meta project that he keeps talking about, I think this is something that's probably it's an interesting prospect in terms of how you can actually create a practice that can float above things while still producing critical work. But at the other hand, it seems very meditative, in that you don't actually need to be bogged down by the restraints of the contemporary day, because you assume you're floating above them and they'll change anyway. So I think Eisenman has almost that kind of approach, especially within his earlier career. I think still now, even when he talks about, is it time to retire? Is this the end of Eisenman? And so on, when he talks about refusing not to build a project because the client's intentions go against broader things. He has this incredibly light and humorous way of approaching it that I think you'd probably encounter even with something like that, which again, I think probably has something to do with the nature of the meta project floating above the world, that it allows him to give distance, comedy, and a bit of a light touch with how he speaks, which again was another, I would say, another misconception that I had about Eisenman that got shattered quite a bit going through these lectures. He always felt like a very heavy and sort of cold and stonish man, and it seems to be quite the opposite the more you look at his work, his lectures rather.
Thank you.
Thank you, Blanche.
Carla.
Volume is down. Thank you, Cem. This was fabulous. I wanted to know if there was any interest in, it picks up on Mehrdad's interest in stitching a couple of other things. I'm thinking that the gold standard, in 73, 75 was dropped. Richard Nixon dropped that as a valuation. And the grain embargo to Europe. I'm just wondering about contextually any of these socioeconomic issues that might have weighed in, because I was a student starting architecture around that time. And when you bring up the word competence, that was the emphasis. It wasn't narrative, it was highly competent work. And I mean, that word rings true. But we were all feeling the impact of the economy. Wonder if there's autonomy from that, or if that has an influence.
Again, I think that's one aspect is, I think within the broader research project, there definitely has to be a framing of global history, right? Within the context of what we're looking at. Within this pilot study of Eisenman, specifically within the lit review, we were able to achieve some more deeper looks into that domain. Again, specifically about when Eisenman's career begins to take off, then is halted, then takes off again, seems to be dealing with similar, moments in American history. I think I'm sure everybody wrestles with the same issue, is a lot of things are of interest, but it almost seems you have to, if you have a game plan beforehand and it seems to be heading towards a productive direction, that you almost have to put the blinders on about those tangents and pursue the broader research project in question. I think in the context of Eisenman, most likely beyond what the lit review establishes, it's difficult to frame a very critical global history, even in terms of article length for an academic piece, like with the 3,000 word background going into the American history of the 1970s, may take a bit too much paper space. But in terms of actually the broader research project, what we proposed was to go through the work and produce, one is a manuscript at the end of 2 years, but then in monthly increments to actually produce podcast episodes. So those would actually be formats within which we can go into those discussions at greater depth, and bring in outside, academics and scholars within the realm to have those kind of discussions. I mean, what you just mentioned about competence, for instance, is quite intriguing. I didn't have that link to the word. I thought it was, echoed something very different to me. But for your context, it's something very specific, right? I think that's very important. Again, all these questions, I think, they seem to be talking about how to frame this within a broader context. The struggle is, one is, where do you find the space to put that forward, whether it's in an article format or a book format, whatnot? How do you devote that kind of space to the context? And how much space do you devote to the actual substance that you're trying to achieve? The other aspect is, I think with the broader research project, again, I think we have probably enough varieties of media that we can pursue that would open up the possibility of framing this in a more interdisciplinary, a properly longitudinal format that doesn't go only into architecture lectures in itself.
Thank you. Marcus, yeah.
Yeah, I just had like a brief observation, and it's more of a curiosity. But the whole story, which is just kind of remarkable to watch it kind of unfold in the way that you talk about it, in the way that you link it back to the lectures. It reminds me so much of discussions I've overheard painter friends and sculptor friends in New York talk about the commodification of art and the struggle for relevance in the face of capital. And I wonder if Eisenman's struggle isn't the same kind of struggle, where someone steeped in architecture as an intellectual art, and in writing as also a kind of secondary expression, or maybe in his case, a primary expression of architecture as an art. And the sands shift so quickly in that 1970s, 1980s period that it's a struggle for relevance. And the way that you kind of play this story out as someone speaking mournfully as a kind of loss of relevance, but also the kind of realization that other architects are able to embrace capital and embrace capital's hairiness and craziness and actually make relevant work from it, like Koolhaas. I think it's also interesting. But I wonder if, the AA seems like, as an institution, it has a long history for the embrace of the artist. And I'm thinking of Hayduck and what Hayduck used to do when he went there, and how he was kind of embraced there. I wonder if you couldn't also find another school that hosted him several times and do the same exercise in combing through its lectures and see if you know, see if in fact the kind of welcome or the kind of hospitality put forward from the institution and that institution's priorities don't have some kind of effect on his talking about capital. So New York Institute of Technology or some other school that that we don't necessarily associate with the promotion of a poetic and intellectual understanding of architecture. He might be saying something else that kind of shifts things a little bit. But I just want to say that I really enjoyed the story of this kind of dissent.
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful exercise to go through. If we can, I think the way the grants we had applied for also, even if it goes through, we can't start officially diving into the broader research project until summer of 2021. So there would be some time between the final refinement of this and the subsequent phase to actually venture into something like that. I think that would be quite intriguing to find that. And that would, again, provide a sample that you say, okay, is the AA an anomaly that's distorting somehow Eisenman's voice? And is he changing how he speaks in this audience? Are there different narratives that begin to emerge in other contexts? The artist one I find actually quite intriguing. And the one, I mean, even within Tafuri's original piece, he's oftentimes talking about art, right? In terms of the same thing, that the industrial design and modern art, and how one is trying to push the efficiency of the machine civilization to the brink, whereas the other one is trying to fetishize the phenomena of contemporary society, even the dystopian ones, right? And I think what Tafuri, one of the few lines that still haunt me is something around the lines of only history will tell if you're the avant-garde or the rear guard. And I think the one example that I keep thinking of with Eisenman is Rothko, and Rothko's relationship with the Seagram murals, and sort of the actions he took, because he had sort of a similar approach. Again, I have a superficial understanding of this story as well, but from what I can understand, he thought that through his meta project, he would be able to confront the highest seats of capital with a physicality that would cause them to question their basic fundaments, right? And then this was stripped from him when he actually goes to, I guess the event that I recall is he goes to have dinner there or something of this kind, and Rothko's this person who doesn't want to pay more than a few bucks for a dinner, and he has this very posh meal, and he despises every moment of it, and then he looks around him and realizes, no matter what I produce here, it's not going to have the shift that I think. And there, I think Rothko has a very specific, at least as far as I understand, look upon himself, the self-critique. I think Eisenman didn't have that. And I think there could have been something quite fascinating if Eisenman said the strategies of form and physicality and concept aren't achieving the type of intervention that I want, the subversion of the broader hierarchies that I'm trying to pursue. Maybe I need to change my game up here and incorporate, again, the economic and the programmatic into it. I would have been fascinated. I'd still be fascinated if he thought of that, because I mean, Eisenman, as far as I grasp, seems to be a very porous fellow in terms of looking at this stuff. It would be great to pick his brain about, were there moments where, in this 1980s, when he's talking about the phenomena of capital and so on, are there moments when he's talking to his peers or himself that maybe it's not the path that's the most constructive? I really like the approach of having another sample size. I think I could manage that. I don't think I can do 3 years on Eisenman, but I think we could do another 6 months on him and really enjoy that. And it's, again, no insult to Eisenman. I don't think I can study anybody for 3 years and not get overwhelmed by it.
Well, I will also mention that one of our colleagues, Katsuo Morimoto, was in Eisenman's office on Saturdays when Philip Johnson would stop by for a regular, I guess what he said was a weekly lunch. And Eisenman was his sounding board. Here was John C. the Kingmaker coming in and essentially laying out the kind of cultural landscape that he, Johnson, wanted to establish through MoMA and through his, connections to corporations, essentially, and just kind of having these, part gossipy and part kind of grand conversations about where the American project was going vis-a-vis architecture. And Katsu would just sit there kind of listening to this stuff with his jaw dropping, because Johnson would say, when I'm gone, make sure Hayek doesn't build anything. I don't want anything built by him in this country, and just all these crazy things. And so, Eisenman's relevance is multifaceted. He's doing his own work, he's writing his own writings, but he's also a kind of junior partner or a right-hand man in this much larger project, for somebody who's really pulling the strings across multi-levels, if we're talking about capitalism.
Yeah, I think also the Philip Johnson relationship is one that continuously popped up in the Lit Review, which I knew sort of bits and pieces of it, but again, that it's the way you're describing it was, it seems to be spot on with what some of the broader literature is also pointing to. Although in your perspective, it's a much more juicy, fly on the wall kind of.
Katsu's a great storyteller, especially when we're sitting in a place, having a beer in Japan and snacking. Like, it's a great story.
Cem, I'm going to read a question in chat that came in earlier that I think we missed from Jose. The question is, do you think we need to rescue architecture from capitalism?
Oof, the big one. One thing I think one thing within this research in particular I've tried to do is restrain the types of conclusions that you can reach through limited works, right? So this is a very specific research looking at Eisenman in isolation and even in isolating a portion of Eisenman as has been discussed to achieve certain ends. With that, based on the research, for sure, there's nothing that I can extrapolate to answer that question. What I would say is I think I grew up in a very anti-capitalist vibe. What I think is quite intriguing in the initial conceptions of free labor, according to Adam Smith and so on, is that it was viewed very much as a complex adaptive system that could accrue a level of intelligence that very well, in that time, the thought was that no top-down system could, right? And if you think about that, that's fairly in line with contemporary thinking about complex adaptive systems in general. So in terms of what it can achieve in terms of complexity, intelligence, in terms of market responses and market reactions and so on, there's something quite fascinating about free labor, right? That being said, the other aspects of it too seem largely embedded within the original path in terms of vast inequities, extraction, endless competition, resource depletion to the point of absurdity. So I think the question isn't so much one about capitalism, but it's more about how do we actually begin to frame alternate paths within architecture. I think some of the question of rescuing from capitalism may be misconstrued as a rescuing from economy, which is the sort of point I'm trying to stress at the end, is that the meta project, if we are trying to reboot at least the intentions of the modernist meta project, we need to be able to understand how economy and how program can be manipulated without an architect relying on the client. There are very specific examples of this, for instance, the architect-developer model of today, although the downside is that much of architect development seems to go within line of high-end luxury development. But there are other instances in history, for instance, kibbutz farming and things of this sort, where form and program and economy and societal and political relationships were all interwoven to achieve very specific both architectural and social and political and economic ends. I think that's probably the more critical question for me, is not so much how do you untangle it from capitalism, but rather how do you achieve enough distance where you can still understand what it can produce, but still pose critical avenues that are far beyond its reach as well. I really have some hope there that there's some we're so embedded within a monocultural global system that if we can start to pursue some other paths, even on a micro level, that we can start to open up quite interesting avenues for this meta project to begin to bloom.
Felicia Davis, also one of our faculty, has a question, and I've turned on her ability to talk. So Felicia, can you just ask your question, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cem, for your lecture. And I'm just going to read my question. And it's more of a comment than a question. I think your arguments about Eisenman in relationship to the kind of upheaval and changes that we've seen happening in particular this summer with the kind of killing of George Floyd really make a kind of foil for Eisenman's work. And it could be really, really useful in terms of understanding, in contrast to a system that might emerge from this. So I feel like it frames what many of us in architecture and architectural education are struggling to transform, or at least provide a different avenue to proceed. So for example, I was thinking that, capital for some in this country starts with extraction of value from free labor. And you mentioned this before, that it has it could never have been read as a kind of fun capitalist project where you're sort of earning money and that money turns into building and it provides I think it always was different for a whole group of people in this country. And so I think these insights could be super useful in terms of what you're trying to do with your study that provides a foil and highlights, in fact, a kind of system that is really difficult to see and really difficult to kind of excavate. And I'm really talking about a system, if I might be really blunt and frank, a system of whiteness and kind of structural oppression. And so in that sense, I find your project to be very exciting and really useful because it does point out these things that actually, Eisenman had all these problems in his office where he didn't pay his interns, for example, right? They would go there and you would work and they wouldn't be paid. They were, supposed to be grateful to work there. And, if you didn't have money, you couldn't work in his office because you weren't going to be paid. So there are all these things like that. But I think that, there are groups that are working now to propose ways of living without owning property, for example, or different ways of organizing architectural labor. So I think I just wanted to thank you for providing this kind of foil to get me thinking about all these other things. And so it's not really a question, it's just throwing that out there for discussion.
Well, some of the thoughts that I found myself considering when you were talking about this is, I think the labor aspect of Eisenman is, I heard a similar story actually with a mural by Diego Rivera in Detroit that there's this big mystery, I guess, when he visited there, the Detroit sort of auto works, he was seemingly quite enamored by the complexity and the efficiency of the assembly line being formulated there. And it's not quite clear, apparently, to a lot of art historians, whether he's showing the machinery of capitalism as a system of enslavement and suffocation, or if he's actually praising its efficiencies. There's that aspect to it, which I find quite interesting. The other one is that apparently he did the same, that he didn't pay for many of his sort of the apprentices and interns essentially that worked under him. He didn't pay them properly while completing the murals. And again, Diego Rivera sort of seems very, very contradictory to his broader political stances. In terms of not owning property and alternative sort of paths, there are some quite fascinating few examples that come to mind. One is actually within the contemporary realm of sort of the logic of the co-op or the cooperative living or co-living taken to a much different level, and how that's beginning to manifest in particular areas that are hard hit. There was a recent article, for instance, in certain portions of, I want to say Virginia or West Virginia, where people have simply extracted themselves from the broader system and are living in sort of a commune. The commune as a historic entity within the United States is another fascinating realm of study. We actually had a few faculty members at the University of Oregon who grew up on communes. But it was this strange phenomena, right, in sort of decades past that flourished in a very bizarre way and then vanished. But I see sort of at least the beginnings of experimentation around that beginning to emerge. The other example that popped to mind is actually Rem Koolhaas's thesis, which I've always, again, emphasized, at least with my students, as one of the more intriguing theses that I've read, particularly because it isn't something that delves with pure abstraction, but actually talks about how you could purchase specific portions of London at the time and produce a very different societal construct within it, right? And I think a lot of times when I've read it in the past, what's been emphasized is more the anarchic and sort of bottom up and grassroots manifestation that would emerge in it, but very little emphasis on the sort of actual economic thinking behind it. Same thing goes actually with the Garden City of Ebenezer Howard, right? It's one of the few utopian visions that actually talked about how you would finance the thing and then subsequently create a different type of ownership and property structure embedded into it. I think architecture history within that realm seems to be ripe for the picking in terms of establishing compendiums of projects that have dealt with the issue of property and alternative societal paths. That type of utopianism I find quite fruitful and quite inspiring, as you're saying, as you begin to see not only where those paths can begin to emerge in contemporary tensions, but also actually how they're beginning to emerge realistically today. Thank you. That connection is a very helpful one. I think we've skirted that one for sure in the discussion.
I think, do we have time for one more question? It's quite late for Cem.
I got time, yeah.
There is one more question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Ignacio Andres Mejia, I'm probably butchering the name, I'm sorry.
That is a student, yeah.
What makes me wonder the most is if that was an opinion, then how would it have looked like, or if it was something inevitable, if he ever wanted to be successful, in a sense, whether it could have been conscious, swift, or not?
What makes me wonder the most is if it was an option, then how would it have looked like? Ignacio, I'm a bit confused if you're referring to when, I assume you're talking about when Eisenman opened up the door for capitalism to enter?
There's a question above it, which if you read the two together might make sense.
What's the question above?
Do you think Eisenman regrets getting into the mud with capitalism? If so, do you think he could have maintained his initial state and still be successful?
Getting into the, if so, do you think he could have maintained his initial state and still? Well, he didn't have a choice, right? He had to make a living, regardless of the current construct. I think the problem is he didn't know how to engage with it. I didn't think he was equipped. I think he was equipped. Eisenman is incredibly, I mean, a fountain of knowledge if there ever was one. And actually how he talks about why he teaches is quite interesting too, because it's sort of, he thinks he says he's received an education that no one else will be able to match in terms of the generosity of his professors. So he's he sees his life as a giving back in terms of that, which I, again, find a very praiseworthy notion. But I don't know if he knew how not to engage with it. Again, once you negate the economic and the programmatic from the meta project, then those aspects have to come from somewhere else. And the thing that provides it within that time period is the dominant economic system of the time, which is capitalism. So I think that's part of the story, is that if he had equipped actually alternate paths and systems within his meta project that were economic, that were programmatic, that had, what would Eisenman look as architect developer? That's a question to consider. Or if you collide architect Eisenman with a developer that has, again, this pursuit of alternative futures for societal visions, that becomes an interesting proposition. But by and large, I think the significant portion of architectural history is architectural projects being produced through upper middle class and upper class socioeconomic echelons, right? And I think actually that's the one thing we wanted to avoid with the research too, because that seems like a standard critique of architecture and capitalism. And so the gap we saw specifically was this vocalized one. But Ignacio, yeah, I would say he hadn't equipped the meta project, then he himself may have, by his own admission at the end, when he says we're no longer in control and capital has consumed much of the philosophy and the aspects of the meta that were critical, I think he begins to understand that too. I haven't heard him frame an alternative path, as in what he would have advised the young Eisenman to do differently. That option 3 is the one that comes to mind after going through all this, that maybe the strict focus on the form and social and cultural came at a cost that was beyond his vision at the time, and beyond a lot of architecture discourse at the time. No, I mean, Eisenman isn't alone in his venture there.
Okay, I think that's a wrap. Thank you, Cem. Thank you, everyone. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. Very fun, as always.
Yes.
Thank you, Cem, Darla,
Thank you.
Marcus, everybody, Pep, Shadi, audience. Wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.